Breaking news, Las Vegas Raiders trade situation with Jack Jones. We've got some big news coming out of Las Vegas. The Raiders are actively looking to trade quarterback Jack Jones. If they're unable to make a deal, Jones is set to be released tomorrow. Let's break down what this means for the Raiders as they move forward. First off, the Raiders might be eyeing a quarterback with the 6th overall pick in the upcoming draft. However, even if they don't select a quarterback, they'll still need to address this position in the near future. So, what does this mean for the Raiders' plans? Let's dive into it. The report came from Vincent Bonsignore, a well-known Raiders insider. According to Bonsignore, the Raiders are working on trading Jack Jones, but if a trade doesn't materialize, Jones will be released by Monday. This report likely comes straight from the Raiders' front office, which frequently works with Bonsignore for breaking news related to the team. Now, this could signal that the Raiders are preparing to move on from Jones. The mention of a trade likely serves as a last call for interested teams, offering them a 24-hour window to make an offer. It's possible they'd let Jones go for as little as a 7th-round pick. But why would teams even consider trading for a player they know will be released soon? Here's the thing. Jones isn't just going to be cut outright. If he's waived, teams would need to go through the waiver process, and teams at the bottom of the waiver order, like the Pittsburgh Steelers or Kansas City Chiefs, might decide to grab him. After all, Jack Jones has proven he's an incredibly talented cornerback. While he hasn't necessarily been one of the top corners in the league in recent years, his potential is undeniable. If Jones were to land with a top defensive coordinator, there's no telling how high his ceiling could go. Think about how much success coaches like Washington's Ron Rivera and Dallas's Dan Quinn have had developing elite cornerbacks. Players like Trevin Diggs and Dante Jackson thrived under their coaching. Jack Jones could be the next in line if given the right guidance. The one issue with Jones, however, is his work ethic. That's been a concern for some time, and it's likely something that's turned teams off in the past. But make no mistake, this guy has the talent. If he's paired with the right coaching staff, he could become one of the best cornerbacks in the league. Jack Jones's work ethic and the Raiders' decision. Jack Jones has shown some serious concerns with his work ethic, and that's something the Raiders simply couldn't overlook. While his talent is undeniable, his attitude and commitment to the game have raised major red flags. According to multiple sources, he has consistently been late for team meetings and workouts. Coaches have scheduled defensive back workouts, but Jack often doesn't show up or shows up late. Max Crosby, for example, is known to be in the building at 6 a.m. every day, but Jack typically rolls in at 10 a.m. or even later. This lack of commitment has been a point of frustration. I had heard about this issue in a report last Friday, and I honestly didn't think we'd see a release this soon. I expected the Raiders to give Jack a chance when the team officially opened on April 8th, maybe even sit down with him for a conversation. After all, he has the raw talent, and with some discipline and focus, he could be a difference maker. However, the issue with Jack is not just his work ethic. There have been past character concerns too. While he was with the Patriots, there were a couple of off-field incidents, including an arrest at an airport. However, those issues never followed him to the Raiders, where he stayed out of trouble. The real problem has been his lack of effort, which fans and coaches alike can't ignore. As fans, we might not always see what's happening behind the scenes, but we can all agree that effort and commitment are key to success, especially in the NFL. Now with the Raiders' upcoming team meetings, it's clear that they need players who will put in the work. I wouldn't be surprised if defensive coordinator Patrick Graham has already set the tone, signaling that Jack's poor work ethic is unacceptable and possibly a deal-breaker for his future with the team. The Raiders have a clear vision for how they want to build, and Jack's attitude doesn't seem to align with that. If the Raiders do release Jack, I'd still hope they could find a way to get something for him. Perhaps a 7th-round pick from a team willing to take a chance on his talent. But if he's cut and goes through the waiver process, some teams might still be interested, especially considering his potential. It's unfortunate because Jack has the skills, but at the end of the day, effort is everything in the NFL. Looking ahead, the Raiders are bringing in a few players who fit their ideal scheme. Eric Stokes, for instance, is a tall, lengthy cornerback, exactly the kind of player defensive-minded coaches like PeteCarroll value. Another name to watch is Jair Brown, a talented cornerback out of Texas who looks impressive on tape. With these types of players, it's clear the Raiders have a plan for building their secondary, and Jack Jones may just not be part of that vision. The Raiders' draft strategy and cornerback needs. Looking ahead to the draft, the Raiders have some big decisions to make. especially with the 6th overall pick. There's been plenty of talk about possibly selecting an offensive tackle or even a defensive end to replace Malcolm Kuntz. But what makes this year's draft class unique is the depth of talent at defensive end. In fact, there are around 12 defensive ends in this class who are expected to be really solid players in the NFL. That means the Raiders could land a strong defensive end even in the 2nd or 3rd round. The key for the Raiders, though, is to build a winning culture. If they're going to create a team where players are committed, putting in the work, and buying into the system, they'll need to move on from players like Jack Jones. And while it's easy to watch tape and see the potential, Jones is quick, fluid, and explosive in coverage. There's still that big question mark over his work ethic. Sure, he's sticky in coverage, and even though he occasionally bites on double moves and gives up touchdowns, he can also make plays with interceptions. But without the right attitude and commitment, the Raiders can't afford to hold on to players who don't show up day in and day out. If the Raiders can trade Jones, that would be ideal. If not, they'll need to move on and look to the future. One position they'll definitely need to address is cornerback. Eric Stokes, who was recently brought in, seems like a strong candidate to start, but his history with the Green Bay Packers raises questions. If Stokes had been a standout corner, the Packers likely would have kept him around. His performance over the past couple of years has been inconsistent, partly because he's been through 2 different defensive schemes. Scheme can play a huge role in a cornerback's success, and Stokes did have a solid rookie year. Hopefully, under the new scheme with the Raiders, he'll be able to find that same level of success again. The Raiders also have promising cornerbacks, like Cameron Richardson and Jacorian Bennett. Bennett looked solid during the past season and could be a key piece moving forward. But at the end of the day, the Raiders will need to add another corner to the mix. The good news is that cornerbacks are a position where you can often find talent in the later rounds. You just never know when a guy is going to develop into an elite player. Ultimately, Jack Jones wasn't a first-round pick for a reason, and the Raiders need to focus on finding a cornerback who fits their system and work ethic, even if that means looking to the draft for a player who can be molded into a key contributor. Drafting for success. Cornerbacks and key positions. When it comes to finding cornerbacks, the draft can be full of surprises. Take a look at players like Dante Jackson, who was a 5th-round pick, or even the underrated Mike Sainristil from Michigan, who ended up with the Washington Commanders. The Chiefs have consistently found elite cornerbacks late in the 1st round, proving that you don't always need to take a cornerback in the top 10 to land a quality player. This is something the Raiders should keep in mind. You can find corners that fit your scheme and develop into solid starters, even in the later rounds. A prime example of this is when the Raiders had Nnamdi Asomugha, who thrived in their press-man coverage system. After he left, he wasn't the same player with the Eagles. In came Stanford Routt, who stepped up and became one of the best statistically. It's proof that the right system can elevate players, even if they aren't high draft picks. Now, it's true that the best cornerbacks in the league are usually top picks. Jalen Ramsey and Derek Stingley, for example, were both picked in the top 10 and have been dominant players throughout their careers. In fact, Stingley is currently one of the top cornerbacks in the league, right up there with Sauce Gardner. But for every Stingley or Ramsey, there are plenty of corners who were drafted lower but have developed into high-caliber players with the right coaching and system in place. That said, if the Raiders find themselves in the top 6 of the draft and have the chance to grab the best cornerback available, they should absolutely consider taking him. While the Raiders haven't had much success drafting corners in the 1st round recently, historically speaking, 1st-round cornerbacks tend to work out well. But cornerback isn't the only position the Raiders need to address. There's also the case of Michigan defensive tackle Mason Graham, who is making the rounds for visits. Adam Schefter reported that Graham will be visiting the Cleveland Browns on Monday and the Raiders on Tuesday. This is an interesting development, as the Raiders have shown interest in adding more talent to their defensive line. When it comes to draft strategy, especially for teams picking in the top 10, certain positions should always be prioritized. Defensive ends, defensive tackles, offensive tackles, quarterbacks, and wide receivers. These positions tend to have the most significant impact on a team's success. For example, drafting a running back or a safety in the top 10 doesn't typically have the same impact as adding a game-changing defensive lineman or a top-tier quarterback. In summary, while cornerback is a key position the Raiders must address, They should also keep an eye on other critical areas like the defensive line, where players like Mason Graham could help shore up their defense. The Raiders and the draft, evaluating Mason Graham and elite positions. When it comes to the impact of certain positions, some are more dependent on the system or other players than others. For instance, wide receivers often rely on their quarterbacks for success, but we've seen players like Justin Jefferson thrive despite changing quarterbacks. Similarly, Devontae Adams found success with multiple quarterbacks, including Garner Minshew and Aiden McConnell, while also working with Jimmy Garoppolo at times. Elite wide receivers are hard to come by, but if you find one, they can completely transform your offense. That said, the Raiders are currently showing interest in Michigan defensive tackle Mason Graham. However, I'm not particularly high on him, and this is one opinion that I stand by. If the Raiders were to select Mason Graham with the 6th overall pick, I'd be disappointed. Here's why. If you're drafting a defensive tackle that high, it's because you need an elite pass rusher, someone who can disrupt the quarterback and change the game. But Mason Graham, while solid, isn't an elite pass rusher. You can watch his tape, and he's just not a top-tier guy in that department. In fact, when you look at the full scope of defensive tackles in the NFL, Graham would probably fall around the middle of the pack, maybe somewhere in the 40th range out of 64 starting defensive tackles. For a 6th overall pick, that's not good enough. You want someone who can pressure the quarterback consistently. If you're taking a defensive tackle in the top 10, you want a game changer like Jalen Carter, someone who can consistently get after the quarterback. Unfortunately, in this draft class, there is no elite pass rushing defensive tackle, and I just don't think Mason Graham is the guy the Raiders should target at number 6. For those who consider Graham a top 3 or even top 5 prospect, I think that's overhyped. Players like Travis Hunter and Abdul Carter are miles ahead of Graham in their respective positions. However, I will say this about Graham. He's incredibly strong. On tape, you can see that he plays with low leverage and can control his blockers in the run game. He's extremely difficult to move, and his ability to anchor and two-gap in the run game is definitely elite. If the Raiders wanted to draft him as a run-defending specialist, I could understand that, though I still wouldn't be thrilled with taking him at number 6. If you admit that he's not an elite pass rusher, then I'd be okay with the pick, though it wouldn't be my first choice. It's worth noting that I don't have a consensus number, one defensive tackle in this class, and I'm not alone in that sentiment. Brett Coleman, a respected draft analyst, shared his own take recently, stating that he's still finalizing his rankings for interior defensive linemen, and I agree with much of what he said. Graham just isn't on the same level as some other prospects in this draft. Mason Graham, arm measurements, and the Raiders draft strategy Brett Coleman, a well-respected analyst, recently stated, "Won't spoil the whole thing, but Mason Graham ended up as defensive tackle 4 for me." Brett is known for being a highly knowledgeable and insightful voice in the draft world. He's not just an analyst, he has extensive connections with NFL general managers and scouts, and his opinions often reflect direct input from these professionals. For example, he was one of the first to call out ShedeurSanders as a likely second-round pick, warning that he probably wouldn't go in the top 10 even as early as last November, when most people thought Sanders was a top-tier talent. And as we're seeing now, Coleman was right. So when he ranks Graham as DT4, it's worth paying attention. Although I don't think there's a clear-cut number 1 defensive tackle in this draft, Mason Graham does have potential, especially in the run game. But when drafting a defensive tackle, particularly at the top of the draft, you're looking for someone who can rush the passer. That's the key. The Raiders are clearly interested in Graham, as they're bringing him in for a visit, and there's the possibility they could select him with the 6th overall pick. However, I'd still prefer a more elite pass rusher in that spot. One of the interesting stories coming out of the draft process this year is the issue with arm measurements. There's been a significant amount of controversy over the NFL Combine's arm measurements, as it's been reported that certain players' arm lengths were measured incorrectly, by almost an inch in some cases. For example, the Senior Bowl and Shrine Bowl had more accurate measurements compared to the Combine. This mistake has led to players like Jonathan Newton falling to the second round last year because his arm length was considered too short. Despite the criticism, Newton had a solid rookie year, proving that sometimes tape matters more than arm length. Now, the Raiders may want to get updated arm measurements for Mason Graham, as his arms are quite short, and it could affect his draft stock. But even with accurate measurements, I'm still not impressed by his pass rushing ability. His pass rush win rate in college was just 5%, which is very low. To put it into perspective, Byron Murphy, who had a 12% pass rush win rate in his rookie season in the NFL, had a much higher success rate. Jalen Carter, for example, had a 23% pass rush win rate in college. So Graham's 5% is a concerning number. Would I be disappointed if the Raiders took him at number? Ahu? Yes, I would be. However, I can understand the logic if they do pick him. Graham is the opposite of what the Raiders currently have at defensive tackle. Adam Butler is a great pass rusher but lacks in run defense, while Christian Wilkins excels as a run defender but doesn't quite have the pass rush upside. Mason Graham could serve as that key piece in the middle, helping to solidify the defense in both run-stopping and occasional pass rush situations. Ultimately, the Raiders are likely moving on from Jack Jones and will probably release him soon. That will open up more opportunities in the cornerback market for the team. The Jack Jones situation has shifted the focus back to cornerbacks in the draft, so we'll have to see how that plays out. Either way, it's going to be an interesting draft for the Raiders. Let me know what you think. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you next time with more updates.